The John Hay Library is the Special Collections Division of the Brown University Library. Our function is to preserve and make available rare and unique items, as well as to house collections that have been compiled by collectors, many of them Brown alumni, on very interesting and specialized themes. This building is named for John Milton Hay, who was Secretary of State under Presidents William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. John Hay was a Brown alumnus of the class of 1858. There has never been an American president who had graduated from Brown, but John Hay served 3 presidents, starting with Abraham Lincoln. Almost his first job out of college was to work in the White House as Assistant Private Secretary to President Lincoln. He had a great fondness for President Lincoln, and for that reason we do have a Lincoln collection. We are in the Bruin Room of the John Hay Library, which began its life as an exhibition area, but now is used as a seminar room. And as you can see, it's also used for actually shelving books in our collections. This document is now known as the Meditation on the Divine Will. As you can see, it is not titled or dated, so this is a title that's been given to it after the fact. It was found in Lincoln's papers after his death by John Hay, as Hay and his colleague John Nicolay, who were grief-stricken at Lincoln's assassination, were trying to pack up the papers. Hay asked Robert Todd Lincoln, who of course is the heir to the family, whether he could keep this document. And Robert Todd Lincoln and he were friends, and Bob agreed. So Hay kept this as a treasured memento of Abraham Lincoln, whom he considered his mentor, almost a father figure. This document, to the best that scholars have been able to date it, we think it comes from about 1862. So it's in the middle of the Civil War. And in this document, Lincoln is talking about the will of God and how both sides in a contest may claim that God is on their side, but one of them has to be wrong because God can't be for something and against it at the same time. And he also begins this sense of talking about how eventually these contestants are going to have to be reconciled. So the language in this document sort of prefigures what becomes known as what becomes the second inaugural address in 1865, just before Lincoln dies. And he says he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest, yet the contest began. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day, yet the contest proceeds. So the idea is that there's some divine purpose behind the Civil War that has nothing to do with whether either side is right. It's about how the issues play out in the long term. I think that's the upshot of his thinking, is that there's some divine hand in this, but it's not what we think it is. It's something that we can't comprehend. It's of great interest to scholars because it shows that Lincoln is thinking about reconciliation years before the war has actually ended. As early as 1862, only a year or two into the Civil War, that he's really thinking about this in a serious way. How can you get the bitterness to subside and have people come back together as a nation? This is a box of memorabilia associated with Thomas Wilson Dorr. Thomas Wilson Dorr was the leader of what is often described as the constitutional insurrection. And the roots of this go back to the American Revolution. In 1776, when the 13 colonies broke away from Britain to form their own nation, 12 of the new states decided that they were going to write constitutions for themselves. Rhode Island was the only new state that didn't. And they took the 1663 charter, which had been given to the colony by Charles II, and they crossed out the word king and went on as though nothing had changed. So this worked for a little while, but by the time you get to the early 19th century and Rhode Island's beginning to develop industry, it became a huge problem because only people who owned landed property could vote, which meant that 60% of the Rhode Island population, 60% of the white men in Rhode Island were not eligible to vote. and it created all kinds of problems for people who were up and coming, establishing new industries, small businesses, large businesses, the textile mills, especially that were growing in the northern part of the state. And there were many attempts between 1817 and the late 1830s to write a new constitution for the state. And here's a sketch of Thomas Wilson Dorr in profile. This was done by Chester Harding in 1836. So at the time that Dorr was a young lawyer, when he was an active participant with others in the effort to write a constitution for the state of Rhode Island, the failed efforts. And unfortunately, each one of these attempts failed because it was killed by the state legislature, which had no particular interest in adopting a constitution which would maybe limit or diminish the rights of the individual legislators. So in frustration, finally, a group of people got together in 1840 and said, hey folks, let's throw a constitutional convention. So they did. They wrote a constitution in 1841. It was known as the People's Constitution. And their opponents got together a constitutional convention of their own and wrote one called the Freeman's Constitution. And these came up for a vote in the legislature. And this time, the People's Constitution won. The Freeman Constitution was voted down. But the people who supported the old charter rules with limits on who could hold elective office and who could vote, decided that they were not going to support the People's Constitution. There were 2 elections that year, and Thomas Wilson Dorr was elected governor under the People's Constitution, but a different governor was elected under the old charter. And that set up a constitutional crisis. Rhode Island is the only state ever to have such a crisis. The crisis ended up in an armed insurrection with the Dorrites on the one side and the Chartists, as they were called, on the other side. The Chartists won because they got support from the federal government, and Thomas Wilson Dorr was thrown into prison. This is the prison cell number from Thomas Wilson Dorr's prison cell. And this looks like this little note is done in Thomas Wilson Dorr's handwriting. It says, the number affixed to the door of the cell of Thomas W. Dorr in the state prison, his name being suppressed in that place. Here's another interesting piece. This is a certificate for what's called Dorr Liberation Stock, for people who were trying to get Dorr out of prison. They signed up for the cause. They'd buy stock to help support the effort to get Dorr liberated from state prison. Dorr was often offered his freedom if he would just renounce his claim to have been governor under the People's Constitution, and he refused. He was a man of principle. Here's a little stylus of some kind that he used. I don't know if he was using it to do some engraving on, copper plates, steel engraving. Maybe that was part of the prison labor they had the men do. But I imagine it was a tool of that kind. The state prison in those days was where the Providence Place Mall now is. And when they were doing excavation in advance of building the mall, they uncovered the old prison cells and found that they were about 3 feet by 6 feet. So they weren't large enough for somebody to stand up in. They were very tiny. And you can imagine how miserable an experience this was. It was stone, it was cold, it wasn't a heated building, and these poor prisoners were set to labor making ladies' fans. Eventually, Dorr was released from prison, and he died a few months later. His health was completely broken by the experience. But he remains a hero to this day for Rhode Islanders who believe in liberty and the expansion of the franchise to everyone. Okay, well this is a very ordinary looking coffee pot. Looks like an old coffee pot that might have been on somebody's stove, anybody's stove. You might have seen this at your grandmother's house or your mother's house at some point. It's just an old wherever Miro coffee pot. What's special about this coffee pot, though, is that it is the coffee pot that was used by Dr. Robert Holbrook Smith, known as Dr. Bob, and Bill Wilson, known as Bill W., who were the founders of AA. And this coffee pot was instrumental in the founding of AA, as they would sit strategizing around Dr. Bob's kitchen table and drinking coffee that they'd made in this coffee pot. So this is the coffee pot that started Alcoholics Anonymous. We're often asked to display it. It's a very ordinary looking object, but this particular coffee pot has all kinds of meaning. beyond its simple shape and appearance to people around the world because of its roots in the recovery movement. Alcoholics Anonymous was founded in the 1930s. You know, Dr. Bob and Bill W., I think, were both looking for a way out of their alcoholism. For people who've been in AA, this is almost an object of worship. You know, this object sort of radiates power and authority for them. So this is all of the 12 steps sort of comprised in one little icon. There are a lot of different ways that people can experience collections. They can come here to do academic research, in which case they're probably looking at a text, or they're looking at a particular kind of material because they're working on a very specific project with a specific idea or goal in mind. But people can also learn by coming to see things that are on exhibit. They can be exposed to things that they haven't encountered before and learn something new about the world in general, or about something very specific that they wouldn't have known otherwise if they hadn't come by the building and seen this particular thing.